In the last part, we were taking a look at the first verse of the Atma Shatkam, composed by the great Guru Adi Shankara when he was a boy of 8. The Atma Shatkam was Adi Shankara's answer to a question asked by his Guru, "Who are you?" If you have not already seen the previous part where we analyzed the first verse, please do take a look. The second verse of the Atma Shatkam goes as follows. Na cha prana sangyo na vai pancha vayu, na va sapta dhatur na va pancha kosha, na vakpani padam na chopasta payu, chidhananda rupa shivoham shivoham. In the first sentence, Adi Shankara says, Na cha prana sangyo na vai pancha vayu. Now, prana is the vital breath. The Yoga Darshana teaches that prana, the breath, the vital energy, can be divided into 5 categories, which are the Pancha Vayus: Prana, Samana, Apana, Vyana and Udana. Adi Shankara says that all these are not the self. Why? If you look at a person who is dead, the one thing that is missing is the breath. Since time immemorial, this is the first check people do to confirm if someone is dead. Death is characterized by the prana leaving the body. So some might reason that the prana, the vital breath, is that which animates everything. But Adi Shankara rejects this notion. As we will see a little bit later as well, he very clearly states in the Viveka Chudamani that prana is just a modification of air. Yes, the prana does have its importance, as we will see with the Pancha Koshas, but the prana is not the self. The next sentence, he states, Nava Sapta Dhatur Nava Pancha Kosha. The Sapta Dhatus are the 7 material essences making up the body. In Ayurveda, they are the Rasa Dhatu, the Rakta Dhatu, the Mamsa Dhatu, the Medha Dhatu, the Asti Dhatu, the Majja Dhatu and the Shukra Dhatu. So they are various things like the plasma, blood, muscles, fat, bone marrow and the reproductive fluids. So Adi Shankara says this too is not the self. And this is very easy to understand. The parts that make up this material body are obviously not the self as well. Now, we come to the second part, Nava Pancha Kosha. Now, this is where most of the discussion will be. The Pancha Koshas are the 5 sheaths, the 5 envelopes that cover the self according to Yoga Darshana. They are the Annamaya Kosha, the gross physical body sustained by food, Pranamaya Kosha, that of the vital breath, Manomaya Kosha, the sheath of the manas, the mind, Vijnanamaya Kosha, the sheath of the intellect, and Anandamaya Kosha, the sheath of bliss. These coverings, these sheaths, move from the gross physical body to the subtle. The main purpose of yoga is to control and transcend all these sheaths and move towards realizing the true nature of reality. Now, Adi Shankara says, Nava Pancha Kosha. He rejects all the 5 koshas, including the Anandamaya Kosha, the sheath of bliss. He states this again in his Viveka Chudamani as well in multiple verses. He actually states, covered by the 5 sheaths, the self ceases to appear like the water of a tank muddied by its accumulation of sludge. Why does he say so? Let us take a look at these koshas one by one and understand why. The first kosha is the Annamaya Kosha. It represents the physical body sustained by food. This is the first level one identifies with and the first thing one has to bring under control. For this, Yoga Darshana prescribes practices like Yama, Niyama and Asanas. But of course, this physical body can never be the unchanging Atma. This is very straightforward to understand. The self is unchanging and eternal. The body changes and even its qualities are very transient. Adi Shankara states in the Viveka Chudamani, Jata Kshana Kshana Guno Aniyata Swabhava. The body lasts for a short time, its qualities change at random, and its virtues are very fleeting. So the Annamaya Kosha is not the self. This is very straightforward. Next is the Pranamaya Kosha, that of the vital breath. This is the second sheath, and the Yoga Darshana prescribes practices such as pranayama, by which the Pranamaya Kosha can be regulated and transcended. Now, without the prana being in control, one cannot proceed to control the mind and possess the right intellect. But this too is not the Atma. Adi Shankara clearly states this in the Viveka Chudamani as well. He says, Naiba atmapi pranamayo vayu vikaro. Neither is the vital breath the Atma, because it is a vikara, a change, a modification of air. And he goes on to say, Yasmat kimchit kva api na veti ishtamanishtam, because it does not know in the least bit what is desirable or undesirable, ishtamanishtam. So this too is not the self. Next is the manomaya kosha, the sheath of the manas, a part of the mind which is responsible for thinking and deliberating. So obviously, the mind thinks and deliberates. Once the breath is mastered, the mind has to be mastered. The mind has to be brought under control. This is the toughest part. The mind is constantly dragged outside by the senses, but by withdrawing and meditating, one can cause these needless thoughts to cease. And which is why the Yoga Sutras state, Yogas Chitta Vritti Nirodha. Yoga is the cessation of the activities and the patterning of the mind. Now, this is very tough as the senses keep distracting the mind and dragging it outside. Adi Shankara very poetically states this situation in the Viveka Chudamani. The Manomaya Kosha, the mind sheath, is the fire of the yajna. The sense organs are the priests. The desires are the fuel, and the fire blazes by the sense objects, which are the sacrificial offerings. The mind, in ignorance, thinks that this material world is the only reality. So this definitely is not the Atma, states Adi Shankara. But Adi Shankara, as a side note, does state that the mind is very important because the mind causes the bondage to the material world, and the mind also can cause the liberation from the material world. How does it do this? It creates attachments for the material and binds a person through the material. Eventually, when on the right path, a person develops a dispassion for these sense objects. And so that frees a person from this binding. And this is the journey that every self, every soul takes. So the mind, the Manonmaya Kosha too, should not be identified with the Atma, the self. Now the next Kosha is the Vijnanamaya Kosha, the sheath of intellect. So intellect is responsible for determination and discrimination. Discrimination between the good and the bad, what is real, what is false. Discrimination is very important for gaining the right knowledge. At the level of mastering this kosha, you know the perceived world, your mind is controlled, so you can begin to understand the true nature of reality. In fact, those who have mastered this level are said to discover new methods to control the perceived world. So yogis and siddhas can change the world to their convenience, and on gaining the control of the Vijnanamaya Kosha is where all these begin to happen. But this buddhi, this Vijnanamaya Kosha, the sheath of intellect, is also not the self. For the same reason that the buddhi is not the self. It is powered by the chit, the consciousness, which it actually reflects very well. The entire mind is a reflection of the consciousness. And this includes manas, buddhi, ahamkara and chitta. But none of them, including the Vijnanamaya Kosha, are not the self. Adi Shankara says that the buddhi is just a modification of the prakriti. It just reflects the consciousness. But it in itself is not conscious. Vijnana samyak prakrite vikara. So, the Vijnanamaya Kosha is just a modification of the prakriti. This too experiences joy, grief, and is subject to change. So, this cannot be the Atma. The final sheath is the Anandamaya Kosha. This is the sheath of bliss, pure bliss that permeates all the other sheaths. So, why is this not the self? Should this not be the self? But Adi Shankara rejects this. He clearly says Nava Pancha Kosha. He doesn't say Chatur Kosha. He says all the Pancha Koshas are not the Atma. This is very important. In order to understand this koshas a little bit better, we need to understand the three states of consciousness that we, and by extension the Atma, goes through every day. The first state is the Jagrat, the waking state. The next is the Swapna Prapancha, the dream state. The third is the state of Sushupti, that of deep sleep. In the waking state, we are aware of the waking world. We have a very good sense of the I, the ego. We have a very set identity. There is no perception of oneness. The objects are external and very real, and they cause in us joy and sorrow. The dream state is subtler than the waking state. But even in the dream state, the dreams are tied to I, me, the dreamer. The objects are the same as those that are experienced in the waking state, but these objects are experienced inside our body in the dream state. And dreams often shake the identity that we have in the waking state. So finally, we come to the deep sleep state, Sushupti. Here, there are no troubles. One is devoid of any pain in the deep sleep state. So you can say there is a certain form of bliss. In this state, the distinction of the I fades away till you get up from a deep sleep refreshed. So you can say that there is a certain form of bliss. And if you remember the three-body doctrine, the body that is very active here is the Karana Sharira, the causal body. Now, Adi Shankara says that the sheath that is the most active in the state of deep sleep is the Anandamaya Kosha. Anandamaya Koshasya Sushuptau Spurtir Utkata. The display of the Anandamaya Kosha is high during the Sushupti, the deep sleep state. And he goes on to say that it only has a partial manifestation. It does have a partial manifestation in the waking and the dream state. When does it manifest? Only on the sight of agreeable objects. So, he says the Anandamaya Kosha is also not the Atma, the Supreme Self, because it is endowed with changing attributes and is also a modification of the Prakriti. He says, Naiva ayam Anandamaya Paratma Sopadikatvat Prakrute Vikarat. Again, the Vikara, a modification of Prakriti. So Adi Shankara basically compares this and says, this is the bliss that is very similar to what we get fleetingly in waking life as well when we see something that we really agree with. So this too is not the Atma. The Anandamaya Kosha is not the Supreme Atma because it is limited, subject to change and the modification of Prakriti. And we can try to logically work this out. You are in a state of absolute peace in deep sleep. But there is absolutely no awareness. You realize this bliss only when you wake up. There is no awareness in the deep sleep state. You wake up and you say, I was in deep sleep. I enjoyed the state of deep sleep. I am feeling refreshed. But who is the witness of this state of deep sleep? There is someone who has been a witness in the state of deep sleep. And Adi Shankara actually comes to this point. He says, when all the 5 sheaths have been eliminated by reasoning, what remains is the witness, the absolute knowledge, the Atman. So the witness of all these 3 states. And this is very important. He says, Yo ayam Atma Swayam Jyoti Pancha Kosha Vilakshanah Avastatraya Sakshi San Nirvikaro Niranjanah Sadhanandasa Vigneya Swa Atmatvena Vipaschita. This self-effulgent, self-shining Atman, which is distinct from the 5 sheaths, the witness of the 3 states, the real, the changeless, the everlasting bliss is to be realized by the discerning wise man as his own self, the Atma. So here, this is the knower of everything that happens in the waking state, the dream state, and in the deep sleep state. So Adi Shankara states that there's absolute entity which is the witness of the 3 states and distinct from the 5 sheaths of covering is the Atma. And what is this witness? He basically says, Yesho Antaratma Purusha Purano. This is the innermost self. Antaratma, this is the innermost self, the ancient being. And what is the essence of this? He says, Nirantara Akhanta Sukhanubhuti, whose essence is the uninterrupted and complete realization of infinite bliss. So basically, the Atma is the witness of all these things, is the innermost self and the ancient being whose essence is, again, complete realization of infinite bliss, which can also be stated as Sat Chit Ananda. Finally, in classic Advaitic fashion, Adi Shankara says, Ataparam Swayam Shakshat Pratyagatma na Chetara. The individual self is truly the supreme Brahman and nothing else. So all that exists is the Brahman, and the Jiva is in essence a drop of the Brahman bound by the mind and the body. So the Pancha Koshas and transcending them are a way and the means for the bound Jiva to move towards liberation. So no material concepts apply to the Brahman in its true state, the liberated state. These are only applicable to the Jiva in the bound state. We will go through and analyze many of these concepts in more depth as we look into the Vedanta Darshana. Looking at it in another way, Adi Shankara says not to get too tied to these concepts, even though you can put them in practice. The yogi controls and transcends the Pancha Kosha by practice of yama, niyama, asana, pranayama, pratyahara, dharana, dhyana, and samadhi. The jnani achieves this by vichara and nididhyasana on the Mahavakyas. And there have been many bhakti saints who reached the highest state of bliss. But of course, actions and practices that were undertaken in the previous lives contribute to it, obviously. The important point is that all paths lead to the realization of the true nature of the self. But the true nature of the self should not be confused with the path that is taken. The path is just an experience, always in the material world. So for these reasons, Adi Shankara says that the Pancha Koshas are not the self either. But very importantly, this does not mean that the knowledge of these components is not required. These concepts are very important because one has to have a healthy body, practice controlling the breath and the mind, even to begin the enquiry into the nature of the Brahman. But none of this is the self in the true nature. That's what he is trying to say. If you're listening this far, the next verse is a bit more straightforward, thankfully. He says, Na vakpani padam na chopasta payu. The human body has 5 organs of action, Pancha Karmendriya, which is the mouth for speech, hands for grasping, feet for walking, and the organs of excretion and reproduction. So Adi Shankara basically says the self, the I, is not the organs of action. This is very straightforward. Finally, after saying these 3 statements, Adi Shankara ends the verse with Chidananda Rupa Shivoham Shivoham. I am of the form of pure consciousness bliss. I am Shiva. I am Shiva. So as we know, Shiva is auspicious, the Parabrahman, that which animates everything. The self is identical to the Supreme Absolute and its true nature is Sat Chit Ananda, pure consciousness bliss. In the second verse, Adi Shankara states, Neither am I the vital breath, the prana, nor the 5 types of vital breaths. Neither am I the 7 components of the body, nor the 5 sheaths that cover the body. Neither am I the organs of action. I am of the form of pure consciousness bliss. I am Shiva. I am Shiva. We will take a look at the next verse of the Atma Shatkam in the next part. As always, the known is a drop and the unknown, an ocean. Peace.